What was that like to make that discovery?
It's little fireworks going off in my head every time it happened.
Welcome to another episode of Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. In today's episode, I'm talking with Dr. Barb Bousted, a meteorologist, climatologist, and author of Wilder Weather, published in July 2025 by South Dakota Historical Society Press. Wilder Weather explores the science behind all of the weather woven through Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books and her life. Barb, thanks so much for being here. As you may know, for every guest, the first time they're on the podcast, we tell their Little House origin story, how they became a fan, and most importantly, how that fandom has manifested in their adult life. So tell us your origin story.
My origin story goes back to first grade, and I was a fairly advanced reader, and my mom picked up a book from a garage sale that was going to be my first chapter book. She gave it to me. I kind of wrinkled my nose. I saw this picture of two little girls looking out the back of a covered wagon, and I wasn't sure I was going to like it. She said, just give it a chance. I really think you're going to like it. It was Little House on the Prairie, of course, and she was right, of course. I loved it, and it didn't take me very long to devour the rest of the series. So I read the books young. I reread them a bunch of times. I'm kind of a rereader person as it is, but I would read the
Raising my hand, rereader.
I would read The Long Winter in the summer to think cold, and I would reread The Long Winter in the winter to remind myself it would be done. And, I certainly reread all of the books at some point or another. They're, just maybe something I'd go through every couple of years and all the way into adulthood, right? They came with me to college. They, stayed with me as I moved around as an adult. It wasn't until quite a bit later that I looked at them more through the eyes of a meteorologist. I had always thought when I read The Long Winter especially that, it sounds pretty bad. I wonder, how bad it really was.
Was The Long Winter always your favorite?
Yes, it always was my favorite. Yes, partly because there's so much weather in it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just a good story too.
Okay.
And I was one of those kids who I found out pretty young because I read the Zokert biography that The Long Winter was the winter of 1880 to 1881. So I was one of those kids who would go back and count up the years, adding every 7 to see if it was going to be a bad winter. So yes.
I think a lot of us have memories of trying to do that math. And just to remind listeners, we are, of course, talking about the chapter in The Long Winter called Indian Warning, where a Native American man comes to De Smet to warn the townspeople about the severity of the upcoming winter, based on it being not just the 7th winter in a 7-year cycle, but the 21st winter in the 3rd of 3 7-winter cycles. The Zokert biography is called Laura. And is there a subtitle?
There is. It's a fairly long one, and it's something like The Life of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yes, and it came out in the mid-70s, a little bit after the start of the TV show, I believe.
Yes, and it was my first introduction, again, fairly young age. I was probably 4th or 5th grade when I read it, that the works that Laura wrote were actually fiction and that there were parts of them that were different from her real life, which was a little earth-shaking. I wouldn't say it was earth-shattering, but, I had to adjust my mindset. I read The Long Winter near the end of the winter of 2008 to 2009. I was living in Omaha at the time, and it was on the, more wintry side of a winter. It was going on too long into spring, and I was just done with it. So I picked up The Long Winter to remind myself that winters will end. And that particular time, for whatever reason, when I thought to myself, I wonder how bad that winter really was, I followed it with the next logical thought for me, which was, I'm a meteorologist. I have tools. I know how to look this up. Why don't I just look it up and see what I can even find about it? And that's what began the research process that became Wilder Weather.
So in 2008 to 2009, you had already started your research.
Yes, it was it was spring of 2009 when I really started to dig in. I was just doing not random. I was doing internet searches of Laura Ingalls Wilder stuff, trying to find more resources, more stories, more data. And one of the things that came up one particular day was an announcement for this conference, this Laurapalooza, that was going to be up in Minnesota. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty cool, but it sounds kind of literary, and I don't know if they want a scientist there. So I emailed the organizers, and I think, Sandra, you were one of them, and asked, is this the kind of subject that would be appropriate for this conference? And I got an enthusiastic, yes, please go ahead and submit a proposal. I came to that conference knowing nobody else in Laura's world. I know some of the folks had known each other at least a little while. They had been friends on message boards. I didn't know anybody. This was my first entry into that world.
So what was that like?
I actually asked a friend to meet me there just so I'd have a human who I recognized when I gave my talk. But I found the group to be very welcoming, and I had booked at a different hotel than most folks just because it was the chain that I happened to have a membership with. And by the end of the week, I was regretting it because I was so far away from everybody.
And I remember very distinctly your presentation and how excited I was and how I could not believe, I think I actually said this to more than one person, we are going to have a meteorologist who's going to talk about the long winter. So very excited. Okay, why don't you tell us a little bit about that very first presentation that you did, and then we'll move on to the book.
I came in with my nerdy weather presentation, ready to show maps and data, and found myself booked in a session where I was also going to be presenting with one of the other scientists in the Laura world, of course, Mr. Jim Hicks. And he is a retired physics teacher who was going to be talking physics of the long winter. I thought that was pretty cool, and how awesome that we were back to back. So I added and improvised a little origin story to the beginning of my presentation because I found that everybody was doing it when they went up. And I thought, well, that gives you connection with the group.
Sure.
And what I remember most is just that I have given a lot of presentations. I go out and, I used to give spotter training talks. I have trained weather service meteorologists. I've given talks to teachers, all kinds of different groups. And the group that I talked to at Laurapalooza in 2010 was the most receptive group that I think I had ever talked to. They were curious. They wanted to know more. They had questions. They continued to come up to both me and Jim through the rest of the conference. And I felt coming away from that not only, was it a good connection with the Laura Ingalls Wilder crowd, but that science-wise, there was some kind of connection there that I wanted to dive into more deeply, that when I connected weather and climate information to Laura Ingalls Wilder and her experience, there's a group of people out there who really are listening. And that group of people is maybe not one that would have just showed up if the subject of the talk was weather, but without connection to Laura Ingalls Wilder. So I found this way to connect with people and continued to want to explore that connection as much as I wanted to explore the weather itself.
And you sure did connect with that audience. The topic of your presentation, you also go into in the book, so I won't give any spoilers, but it's basically about the seed wheat trip allegedly taken by Cap Garland and Almanza Wilder in the long winter. Okay, I like how you call the book the result of a cascade that began with the one question, was the winter actually as hard as Laura said it was, which is the winter from 1880 to 1881. When did you first get the idea that this could be a book?
I've always liked writing. I don't think I had thought that I would ever have the time to write a book. But when I presented this at Laurapalooza in 2010, as I had questions from folks who were very famous in the Laura world, people whose books I had read, one particular author, Pamela Smith Hill, said as I was approaching her for an autograph on one of her books, that the material I had presented was very interesting and that I should consider writing a book about it. And that planted the seed way back in 2010 that there might be something here that people were interested in, really interested in. That coincided with me starting a PhD program at the University of Nebraska. So for 4 years, I'd worked my tail off on this research, not to write a book, but to write a dissertation. And by the time I came out of that, just a couple months later, I gave birth to my son. So writing was kind of off the table for a little while. But I came back around to the thought of writing piece by piece. I wrote a blog entry here, or, a piece for the Laura Ingalls Wilder Legacy and Research Association website. I wrote a magazine article actually back in 2012 for the magazine Weatherwise. So these little bits and pieces came out. But I finally sat down in, I think it was 2018, to say, you know what, let's take these bits and pieces, the dissertation, the work I've done, and actually try to shape a book out of this.
What was the title of your dissertation?
So the title of my dissertation was The Hard Winter of 1880 to 1881, Climatological Context and Communication via a Laura Ingalls Wilder Narrative.
One of the coolest things that I found out reading this book, besides all of the general Wilder weather stuff, is that you invented something.
I did.
And did the research, I'm going to ask you more about it, but did the research to invent that come as part of your dissertation?
Yes, it did. So the thing I invented was a weather index called the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index, AWSSI, which I pronounce as Aussie. And this is basically a scoring system for how severe a winter is. And day by day through the winter, you add up points based on the temperatures, high and low temperatures, the amount of snow that fell that day, and the snow depth laying on the ground. It accumulates all through the winter. So at the end of winter, you end up with a number that's like a score. And
so there was no way to say how bad a winter was before this, correct?
Yeah, it's hard you have to quantify it if you want to compare it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because what's severe to me may be different to you. So if I'm going to say I want to compare two winters, I had to put some kind of numbers on it. And I found a collaborator, Steve Hilberg, who had retired from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, who also had a similar curiosity. He wanted to be able to rank and score winters, to put some kind of number to it so that we could compare them. Meteorologists like to do this, right? We have hurricane scales, tornado scales, drought scales. We wanted a winter scale. I worked with him very closely to develop this. It was a strong collaboration. And in fact, the index, you can still find it online. It still runs every year, and it's hosted by the Midwestern Regional Climate Center.
And I think the Weather Channel even gave it a nickname.
So the Weather Channel nicknamed it the Misery Index. But I have to defer to my research collaborator, Steve, because he and I come at winter from slightly different perspectives. He loves it. He could lay out in the snow all day and be perfectly happy. He wants all the snowstorms. I like a little dose of winter, and then I'm done with it. And I want to put it away and move on to warmer temperatures. So to me, when I say a winter is severe, I think to myself, bad, right? Like, That's a bad winter. That's a not good. That's hard. To him, that's the kind of winter he likes. So what I learned from him and what I applied to this study, and really anything else I talk about, is what's bad to somebody is not bad to everybody, right? A winter that has a lot of snow can be really inconvenient for somebody who has to drive a lot, but it is also how snowplow drivers make their money. It is what ski resorts need in order to stay in business. Some economies depend on that snow. Some ecosystems depend on that snow. So it's not fair to put a label on it that says it's bad or good, because that's an opinion. That's not science. So the Winter Misery Index is fun to say, but in deference to Steve, I've tried really hard to not say that a winter was bad.
Okay. We will not say that any winters were bad, just that they were long.
They can be long. They can be severe, extreme, mild, moderate.
But not bad.
But not bad or good.
That's more subjective. I understand. I do love this book. Really, really, really lovely writing. I was so impressed. I knew it was coming for a while, and I was so excited to be able to finally sit down and dedicate time to finishing it. It was awesome. Love it.
Thank you so much. That really means a lot coming from a writer, because I felt fairly confident in the research. And I feel fairly confident as a writer of academic papers or short articles. Writing a book is a whole other beast.
It's a whole other beast.
So I do really appreciate that. This is the first book I've ever written, and you never know what sounds interesting in your head, if it's translating in the words you're writing.
You did organize it very deliberately. Was that something you planned from the beginning, or was that more of an organic choice as you compiled your research?
That was a carefully crafted decision after several attempts to do it a different way. So when I first started writing this book, in my head, the natural progression I thought of was home site to home site in order that she went, right?
So basically in order of the books, pretty much.
Pretty much, with insertions of, Baroque and other things that were omitted.
Sure.
But not every book has the same amount of weather, and not every human comes at a weather story from the perspective of Laura Ingalls Wilder. So although my Wilder fans would get it, anybody who was just wanting to learn more about the weather would feel like, well, you were talking about snow, now you're talking about storms, you're back to snow again, now it's cold.
Yeah.
It would feel disjointed. And I actually, I was under the care of a wonderful book coach who took that first draft and said, great academic work. You have to tell a story. There has to be a point at the end that is bigger than, this is really cool. Look at this interesting little weather thing. That's not a point. That's how you get to the point. So I gave that a spin in a different direction. I was writing through again and I got stuck. I went through my outlining process again. There's a whole outlining process that book coaches have developed. And I went through it again because my favorite podcast was leading an exercise in it. And if you submitted your homework for all 10 steps, they put all of the names in a drawing and somebody would get picked to get book coaching from the founder of all of book coaching. And I won that drawing. I got all my homework done and I never win anything. And I won that drawing.
But I bet you always do all your homework.
I do always do my homework, yes. Even if I'm scribbling ambition as an essay right before it's due, I still always do my homework. I've won this drawing, so I got time with this book coach. And again, I had a lot of good prompting from my first coach, but from this one, she read the manuscript and said, it's like you're right there. I just want to turn the screws a little, tighten it up a bit, and put a little more flow to it. And she and I worked together. The flow I had figured out was okay, but it just needed more of a connecting thread. And what I ended up doing was dividing the book into 3 parts. So the first part is learning to trust where weather information comes from. How do we trust it? How do we know that we can believe it? And that includes the weather data, so understanding the history of it and where it comes from. And also stories like Laura's and others that have been told, journals, for instance, or letters or newspaper articles that give not the numbers and data, but the story of what happened. Because you do truly need both. And when they converge, when they tell a similar story, when they paint a similar picture, you get more confidence that the information you're finding is accurate. So you trust the storytellers, you learn to trust the forecasts, and from there you move into paying attention that we maybe don't pay attention now as well as Laura did in her time, right? And
because we have other people paying attention for us.
Right. And we aren't so connected, life, death, and feast or famine to the land individually. Laura had to know what was going on with the weather because one storm could put them near starvation for the winter. And on top of that, Laura was describing her surroundings to Mary from the time her sister Mary went blind onwards. So she was used to paying attention to those details, and she did it in a way that helped her shape not just remembering that there was weather, but really what it was like. So paying attention like Laura did in our time means something a little different. It means, yes, go out, look at the sky, understand what's happening, and also listen to the forecasts. And, we are so lucky in our time to have so much weather information. We get warnings about blizzards a couple days in advance. What Laura would have given for that, right?
Right.
We have tornado warnings, and are they perfect? No, but, do they do a pretty good job most of the time? Yeah. In the scheme of how big land is in the United States,
Mhm.
putting it together enough to get it that close to where it is. And also to say, somewhere in this 3-county swath, there's going to be a nasty blizzard. We are able now to put so much more information together, even than we could 10 or 20 years ago. And then the third piece comes with connecting the weather and the climate to everything else that's around us. So that kind of starts with thinking about the grasshoppers from on the banks of Plum Creek. That's not a weather incident exactly, but it is very shaped by the weather that was going on for those few years during the locust infestations. Weather and climate affect everything around us, right? They affect the vegetation, what's drying out or what's greening up. It affects the animals, where they're moving. It affects us humans and our own health. By the shores of Silver Lake, we hear of people who are going west for the prairie cure for consumption.
Which is tuberculosis, correct?
Which is tuberculosis. And the belief at the time that being out in fresh, dry air would alleviate or cure consumption or tuberculosis, which actually was not horribly unscientific. It was not the full story. You need, antibiotics to kill the bacteria, but also symptoms do get better when you are in a dry climate, and it doesn't spread as fast if you are outside. So
Maybe Mr. Woodworth knew what he was doing.
Not totally wrong. Those are the pieces that come together to tell the story, which is, we can trust the weather information coming to us, especially where it converges. We can pay attention, like Laura did, to see what is coming and see the impact that it has. And then we connect that to the world around us so that we understand how our lives are connected to the weather and climate around us.
So how trustworthy was Laura as a weather storyteller?
She was really darn good. Now, for those who have been reading Laura's books for a while, and especially if you've read biographies or the Pioneer Girl manuscript or other things that put it in context, there were things in her books that were not always totally truthful. And I mean, I don't think I'm surprising anybody to say, Nellie was not one character. She was based on several different people in Laura's life. The weather details, she got so close to being accurate, so good, so much, that it was really more of a surprise when she didn't match the conditions in some way. For almost every big event in her books, I could find the basis for what she was talking about, even if the time or the place were a little bit out of sync with the story compared to the reality.
What was that like to make that discovery?
It's little fireworks going off in my head every time it happened, where I was like, wow, that tornado happened. Oh, look, I have a picture. And oh my gosh, that freeze, the July 4th freeze, there was a story that was, that happened. And
the one in Farmer Boy.
That's right.
Yes. And speaking of that sort of, I don't want to spoil too much. I don't want to spoil anything really, but that was a little disappointing to me that, well, it's cool that the freeze happened, but what they were doing to save the corn doesn't really seem to be something that saves corn.
Yeah, so they were so close to the right methodology to protect a crop or plants from a freeze. And I don't think it's spoiling much to say that if you want to keep crops or plants safe in a freeze, there are a few things you can do to keep the temperatures warmer near the surface of the leaves that will add some measure of protection. So folks might have seen in the news, sometime in their lives where there's a freeze in Florida where they're growing citrus and the sprinklers are running, right? And there's all these icicles off of the oranges and you're thinking to yourself, how can that possibly keep them better, right? There's icicles dripping down. But it does because that ice actually, as it freezes onto the plant, releases just a little bit of heat. And it keeps that temperature closer to freezing, but doesn't necessarily allow it to drop down way below freezing, which is where the damage really happens, as long as you keep putting water on it. Now, pouring water on it once and walking away does not have the same effect. So where they were pouring water on those crops, they were actually probably doing more harm than good.
We'll forgive her, and we'll forgive Almanzo for telling her that. If he indeed did, my theory is that he actually didn't even read the books, but who knows?
That's a good question.
That's just the wife and the daughter. That's not my stuff. It's just my theory. I'm sure we can talk about that on a later episode.
That would be interesting.
Yeah. I can only imagine how great it felt with your fireworks every time, like to find out. I mean, you actually can kind of pinpoint a possible date for the sugar snow in Little House in the Big Woods. That's fantastic.
That is because a sugar snow sort of has a particular weather condition associated with it. A sugar snow is, well, I mean, I think the label sugar snow was more of a Laura thing, but when temperatures get above freezing during the day and below freezing at night, that induces sap to run in the spring as trees are coming back to life after their winter dormancy. And the longer those conditions go on, the more sap that runs. So that sugar snow allowed the nighttime temperatures to go below freezing. It kind of helped that process happen. And the daytime temperatures were getting above freezing. So they only lived there a few years. So I could look through the records for times in the spring when there was snow or some precipitation, when the temperatures during the day got above freezing and during night went below freezing, and that went on for, some prolonged time, more than just a day or two, and found a window of time when they lived there, when that happened. So I think that's when the sugaring snow and the sugaring off dance happened.
I love that so much. Something that really made me think was you pointing out, and we don't need to go into it a lot. I want everyone to read the book, but the long winter was a pretty rough winter, or severe, but there were also some pretty bad winters when they were living in Walnut Grove.
Yeah, the long winter was not the only hard winter of Laura's days. It almost certainly was the snowiest. But there was another winter that, if you use the Aussie, actually ranked even more severe in a place where Laura lived, and that was in Walnut Grove. And it was one of the winters she lived there, which is interesting because in Laura's narrative, grasshopper weather, I'm using air quotes around that, was warm and dry summers and mild winters, which seems to have been a little more of a narrative tool than an accurate reflection of exactly how those winters went, because between the two worst summers of locust infestations was that hard winter, the one that ranks even more severe than the one that she calls the long winter. It was more of a temperature thing than a snow thing, although it certainly had enough snow too. But it's interesting then to think about why she changed the narrative, why she put that out of sync, because she does eventually, near the end of the book, start to bring in blizzards and a cold, snowy winter. So I don't know if that was a memory issue or a narrative tool. She had all the pieces there. She just put them out of order. And we know she did that with other things in her life. So yeah. I don't know why, but it was a little different.
Another thing that I didn't realize that you point out, it's presented as, at least to me as a reader, more of a nuisance than anything. But the flooding that happened after the long winter, I mean, you talk about it rerouting rivers and destroying towns. I mean, that's insane. I had no idea.
She really underplayed the flooding at the end of the long winter and talked about a couple muddy roads, and the trains were going to have a bit of a hard time still. But in reality, there was this record snowpack on the ground extending across like almost all of the plains and upper Midwest. And then there was a sudden melt, and all of that water has to go somewhere. At that time, that flood of 1881 set records that lasted up until just about 10 or 15 years ago in a lot of places.
Wow.
And that snow melted, and it has to get through the river systems. And the rivers up in the upper Midwest and the plains drain into the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. So all of those rivers, all of those tributaries flooded. And that flooding really did damage, right? As you mentioned, there were some towns that were eliminated or partly destroyed and had to be moved. There were cut-off lakes called oxbow lakes that formed and were cut off in that flood. So there were landscape changes, and major cities flooded, like Omaha, for instance. So this was a really big problem. And one additional piece of this, and you can read a little bit about this in Cindy Wilson's book, The Beautiful Snow, too, is that the floods re-damaged some of the railroad tracks, right? So they just get the snow cleared out. We're just going to start getting trains through. Now here come the floods, and all of a sudden bridges are washed out, or railroad beds are washed out and we can't move trains again. So it really prolonged that lack of trains coming back into service, especially in some areas that were over these major rivers.
If you can, tell us, I can only imagine your research process must have been just ginormous, because it's not like you were comparing manuscripts from a literary perspective. It's not like you were doing a character study. It's not like you were looking at the clothes they were wearing. You were looking at the weather, which was just all encompassing, right? I mean, you looked at Eliza Jane Wilder's diary. You looked at issues of the De Smet News and Leader. You looked at letters between the Ingalls sisters. You looked at letters between Laura and Rose. I mean, when did you know when to stop?
Oh, I had to stop? There's so much information. At some point, yes, I stopped and said, I have enough here to tell the story I want to tell. There are a lot of weather records, reconstructions of past weather that are like forecast models, but run for history instead of for the future. Like all these cool weather tools that I can use. And then there are going into paper records or archived records. Often I'm accessing those online, but they are paper records, and pulling all these pieces of information together. And I know there are data sets out there I haven't investigated yet. And yes, to me, I'm like, what if I did that one more thing first, right? What if it filled a gap? I will be writing about this for the rest of my life, because there will always be something else to look at, some other piece of information that puts one more piece into the jigsaw puzzle, or some other weather phenomenon that somebody asks me about, where I can connect it to Laura's narrative and give some information that might help somebody. So this goes on, and it will go on even when I've moved on to writing other things.
And speaking of writing about this for the rest of your life, you also, I will remind everybody, have a Substack called Wilder Weather that anybody can find. But what is the actual URL?
wilderweather.substack.com. It's pretty simple. And
Great.
I use that to go into more depth on things that are maybe fresher in the news or kind of related to the season we're in, or are a little more of a tangent to the Laura story, so they didn't quite fit in the book, but still a story I want to tell. And I'll give one teaser of information. One of those things is looking at shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, because as those who really dig into Laura lore may know, Ma's birth father, died on the Great Lakes in a November gale. So around the time of the November gales that took out things like the Edmund Fitzgerald and other famous ships, it was interesting to go back and reflect on those shipwrecks through time.
I do want to say that I do read footnotes. I love how you consulted with crime thriller author Wendy Corsi Staub to find out if Pa actually could have survived in that snowbank on the banks of Plum Creek. And she said, probably not. Is that the case?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are things you don't mind putting into Google, and there are things you're like, if someone goes back into my history, that's not going to look good. So Wendy Corsi Staub came to the first Laurapalooza. She is a prolific and very successful author.
She was a keynote speaker at the first Laurapalooza.
She was, and she loves the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, and came out of her own interest. But she and I connected there, and she had actually asked me a weather question or two about some of her books. So I asked her if she had ever researched this for her own books, about how long somebody can survive when exposed to cold, or, what condition they would be in if they were found. And she actually then turned and asked some of her thriller writer friends too, to sort of create a collaborated answer to answer my question. And yes, probably Pa would not have survived 4 days in a snowbank, even if he was sheltered from the wind, wearing only a buffalo coat and basically eating snow for water.
Yeah, even if he did have oyster crackers and candy.
Right. That's a long time to be exposed to those temperatures.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So as I was reading, I was thinking, okay, did she just read the books and highlight or circle or put a tab on every single mention of rain, hail, snow, wind, storms, floods, river rising, anything like that, ice cracking? And The answer is?
Yes, of course I did. And in fact, although this is via voice and audio recording, so your listeners won't be able to see it,
Ooh,
I
but
am
I can
holding
see
up
you
my
right
copy
now.
of The
I
Long
Which
Winter.
book is that?
The Long Winter.
I
The
am looking at a
covers,
copy of The Long Winter, which has, the cover has definitely already fallen off.
it is basically disintegrating now.
I think a lot of us have disintegrating Little House books. I love it. But inside that disintegrating copy of The Long Winter are what looks like many, 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 many pink Post-its.
Correct. And all of them have little annotations on them for why I marked that spot. Quiet and warmer weather. No train. Blizzard. Next blizzard. Once I realized I was going to do more than The Long Winter, I went through the entire series, reread all of them, and flagged every mention that was remotely weather related.
And you talk about weather in Mansfield, even, after they moved, and you talk about weather in Connecticut, where Rose was living. You talk about weather, I think, even in Texas.
Yes.
Yes.
Because Laura's letters to Rose were rich with quite a few of these details, right? She never stopped looking at the weather, so she would comment on things like dust that was blowing over during the Dust Bowl years, or high or low rivers. They had a tornado, and Rose happened to live in Connecticut during a hurricane and in Texas during a hurricane. So there was all of these little tidbits to pull out, all these pieces of information that came out of the letters too.
So she was a lifelong weather observer.
She never stopped. She never stopped. The farm girl never left her.
Awesome. You also, in the book, include photos, and you include one famous photo of what may well be the summer storm that Laura writes about in These Happy Golden Years. So tell us about this photo. What makes it so unique and so amazing, and how Laura may have even had a hand in verifying its authenticity.
So the funnel of the tornado has a pretty distinct shape, and one that's not very common. So that is why a lot of folks through the years have thought, well, been dismissive. Oh, that can't be a real tornado. But there are other accounts besides this photograph that sort of corroborate this, that there's this interesting three-funneled look to this tornado. And one of those is Laura's account. She describes it that way. And then another is a sketch that has come up through the years. Somebody sketched the tornado, again, three funnels, kind of separate from each other, weird looking. But the fact that there are these three separate accounts does, again, that convergence of results, right? The more that they come together, the more you think, well, there's probably something to this.
So tell me, what is the difference between weather and climate, and how should we think about those things in relation to the Little House books?
Great question. The sort of easiest answer is weather is short term and climate is long term. It's a lot of weather together over a period of time, so you get a feel for sort of the range of possibilities. But I'm an analogy person, so I'm going to give a couple of analogies. You can think of weather as being what you choose to wear on a day, your outfit. But climate is everything in your closet, because you have all the things you need for the different conditions you'll experience. That's one analogy. And then the other one, and probably my favorite one, is related to baseball. My kiddo plays baseball. I watch sports pretty freakishly, shall we say. So I like the analogy, and it's a very good one, of a batting average for a baseball player, right? The batting average takes into account not just a single at-bat, but how they have performed through their entire career or through an entire season. So you get a feel for maybe who is hitting well, who is not hitting well. And even so, the average is only one piece of information. You can have players who are higher batting average players and ones who are lower. And a single at-bat, you might want your higher average player at the plate because they're more likely to get a hit. But it doesn't guarantee they're going to get a hit just because they have a higher batting average. They can still strike out. They can still walk, get hit by a pitch. There's a lot of outcomes that can happen that are sort of baked into that batting average. You're just choosing that batter because the odds are better that they're going to have a hit. And really, that's what climate does, is it tells you what the odds are better for. The range of possibilities and maybe scenarios that are more likely than others. So that look at how weather behaves over time is where we're looking at climate. And when I say over time, that definition kind of depends on what you're using it for. Sometimes somebody is talking about the most recent 10 years, or they're looking at the whole history in a location. Sometimes people are thinking over, centuries or millennia. All of those are correct. There's not a wrong there, as long as it's enough time that you get a range and not just one weather event shaping what you're looking at. So in the Little House books, I think one of the most interesting parts of the climate side of Laura's books is that they moved into these different sites without a feel for what that range of possibilities was. They didn't have the history of weather observations that we have now. The American Indian tribes that were in those areas probably did, but the settlers coming in weren't really asking about it, so they didn't get that piece of information. So they were moving into a new climate without any information about what that climate was or what that range of possibilities was. When they moved to De Smet in 1880, the long winter kind of smacked them right away. They didn't anticipate that that was in the range of possibilities. They didn't prepare for it, nor did they understand at the time that that was really the severe end of what a winter can be there at that time. It's a little bit of a parallel to us now, where as climate shifts and changes and moves, what we have expected in the past, how things have behaved in the past, may not be how they behave in the future. So we need to also be paying attention for those possibilities to change and expand as we move forward. So for instance, rainfall amounts that we maybe never could have imagined can start to happen as these climate shifts happen. Winters like the past get harder to happen because the climate's shifting. So Laura and her family really had to try to understand and adapt to their climate on the fly because they didn't have information about it. We are adapting to a climate on the fly because it's changing around us.
I have one final question. Do you, and I know you do, have a favorite weather event, whether from the books or from your research? And if so, what is it?
In some respects, that's like asking me to pick a favorite food. It's so hard because they all are so interesting in their own ways. So I'm going to give you maybe a couple just because I don't want any of my weather children to feel left out here.
Right. You don't want anybody to get jealous.
That's right. The long winter is an obvious choice. There's just so much information in her telling of what happened that winter. So much rich detail of not only the weather itself, but how it affected her and her family in the town of De Smet. It's really like a manual of understanding what happened that winter. I think the tornado story is really fascinating because, I don't know, I like tornadoes, and the fact that they were buggy riding during the tornado and kind of inadvertently storm chasing is kind of fascinating for this little weather nerd that I am. And I think the locust story is imprinted because it really starts to pull together how weather in far away places affects what's happening here where we are. In Laura's case, the origin of those locusts, it's that location far away from where the Ingalls family was that was affected by weather that caused the swarm. Where they were living, that was the effect, not the cause. They were living in Minnesota where green things were growing. Mm-hmm. It's drought in the mountains and in Kansas that forced the swarm to happen. And that connection between things that are happening far away and on bigger picture scales and how that had such an impact on their little family, their little town. It's I think, a kind of striking example of that interplay between weather and climate and what is around us in our landscape.
And all of those things that you just mentioned, I believe you presented on all three of those at different Laurapalooza conferences.
I have presented on a good number of the things in the book. There's still plenty more, so I hope to keep presenting for years and years to come because I can always pull some weather out.
Awesome. And we hope to see even more in the future. I think the next conference might be in about 3 years, so maybe 2028, but people will have to tune into the Laura Ingalls Wilder Legacy and Research Association to find out when that is.
Yes, and I will definitely be tuned and watching.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Boustedt. I love calling you that. You can find Wilder Weather. Where can they find it? They can find it at Amazon, but they should probably buy it somewhere else, shouldn't they?
I like to recommend the South Dakota Historical Society Press directly. They are very prompt at getting that book out the door and in your hands, and they always have it on supply. You can get it anywhere you get online books. So yes, you can get it from the major booksellers. You can also go into your independent bookstore in your town and ask them to order it for you and support that local business. And the museum home sites, those gift shops are carrying the book as well, so you can go find it there. I am hoping to continue to make the rounds to places where I can offer signings. I'd like to get to as many home sites as I can in the coming year or more. And I have made my way to a couple of places here and there where I travel. So if you can't catch me at one of those, just drop me a message. Let me know you bought the book and you want a book plate for it, and I'll be happy to mail one out to you. And if you can catch me in person, I love meeting people and answering their questions about weather, because everybody likes to talk about the weather.
You can find Barb online at her Substack, which is, again,
wilderweather.substack.com.
Anything else we should share about how they can find you?
I have a website, wilderweather.com, and you can find me there with links to the various places that are selling the book, other things that I have written, and the Substack. So it's kind of a hub for all of the things.
Great. Barb, thank you so much for being here. And thanks to the rest of you for listening. If you haven't gotten the book yet, Wilder Weather, get to that, because you will love it. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Barb, who give so generously of their time and their knowledge. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. As Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup, and as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a little house world.